Dear viewers of the Tom Photo channel, I just posted a video with my photos taken in the Brittany and Normandy regions of France. Check out the link down below if you're interested. Today I'm telling you exactly how I took these photos, why I did it the way I did, and I'm also giving you statistics with the technical parameters. In order to travel light, I only took my Fuji X-T20 with the Fuji XC 16 to 50mm version 2 lens with me. Why this setup, given that I have an array of cameras to choose from? I like how the X-T20 handles. It is the most intuitive camera in my hands. The X-T30 is very similar, but the X-T20 has more dreamy, less accurate colors. For vacation videos, this is a plus. The differences are very subtle, but I prefer the X-T20's color rendering. The Fuji XC 16 to 50mm lens is also an obvious choice because it's an ultra-small zoom lens with enough sharpness. The 16mm end is great for city streets, and the 50mm is adequate for most faraway subjects. The maximum aperture of 3.5 is a bit dim, but this is compensated by really nice image stabilization. I took no fewer than 1,484 keeper photos during the 11-day period. That's 135 photos per day. Because of the sheer number of photos, I made a decision beforehand to shoot only JPEG. For consistency, I always went with a standard film simulation. Because the conditions ranged from even light to extreme contrast, I played around with dynamic range settings and exposure compensation. This is the distribution of my exposure compensation settings. I had no idea it would look so symmetrical. Typically, I find that the Fuji X-T20 tends to underexpose just a bit in some situations. However, based on what I'm seeing now, it looks like the camera's metering agrees with what I have in mind. Dynamic range was set to DR 100% in 21% of the photos, DR 200% in 55% of the photos, and DR 400% in 24% of the photos. DR 100 is for crisp photos in easy light, DR 200% is my most typical setting, and DR 400% is reserved for photos with extreme contrast, such as buildings in the dark next to buildings in the sun. This is a good way to go about it. But you have to tolerate the ISO 800. This is the minimum value for DR 400% photos for Fuji X-T20. The highest ISO I used with the Fuji X-T20 was 3200, and that was for the night shots. But in the dark even this ISO together with f3.5 might struggle at times, so the lowest shutter speed I used was 1/8. Obviously that required finding a wall for extra support. Speaking of ISO, here is my ISO distribution across all photos. You'll notice they are on the higher side, and this is because of all the high dynamic range settings. The three minimum ISO values for the three dynamic range settings stand out in the graph. This is the distribution of f-stops I used. Because the majority of my stops were in bright daylight and I wanted good depth of field, f8 clearly stands out. Here I have plotted the focal length settings across all the photos I took. I've seen this pattern with my kit lenses before. I tend to use mostly the wide angle and telephoto ends. The former is best for streets and the latter for more distant shots. I keep surprising myself with how seldom I use the intermediate focal length. The shutter speed graph suggests that 1/60 was my predominant choice. 1/7000 that you also see was most likely at f3.5 in bright sunlight. I like clean compositions. This is not always ideal for photography because you risk being boring and predictable. However, I still like it. A good composition brings peace and lets you focus on what the photo is really showing. Most notably, my horizons must be spot on perfect. A tilted horizon is a big problem in my book. I love the rule of thirds. I always correct the slanted lines of buildings and turn the diagonal lines back up the way our eyes see them. I've made a video on how I do this. Please check out the links below. If some lines are not perfect, it's because I simply could not make them better. At some point, correcting lines further leads to unacceptable distortions elsewhere. For example, slender buildings may start looking stout and unnatural, so there's a balance. All these actions require that I crop my photos, and indeed I crop most of them. This graph shows how much I cropped on average. A vast majority of my photos get cropped a little bit. All of my photos were sharpened very slightly, as I discussed in my recent video, also linked below. It just adds that extra spark if you're subtle about it. There were certainly situations where I could have liked to use a raw file. Most notably, the landscape views with a lot of haze and poorly defined clouds could have benefited from raw treatment. However, my exercise in France this time required that I get away with only JPEG and still get a decent result. So this has been a technical overview of how I photographed my vacation. How does it differ from how you handle it? Let me know. Thanks so much for watching and possibly subscribing and liking. Till next time, goodbye.